sort of up until a year ago, it was a real challenge. And I think probably the 3 years before that, you had a tough time in the domestic economy. You had regulation, which was seen as being particularly anti-private companies. We've seen the tech sector, education, and you've had geopolitics all come together. We can sort of touch on each of those. Perhaps what's really interesting is that things definitely changed in the middle of last year, to the point at which there have been inflection points in the domestic economy. So certainly in that area, what was effectively seen as a headwind is very much now a tailwind. We've had coordinated policy stimulus that came out September, October. And that's really quite important, just seeing that Xi Jinping cares about the economy. Now, I think before that, there was a question of whether or not his ideology didn't do that at all. And the market has had to get used to this idea. He is far more pragmatic than we thought. Then you took at regulation. And again, a real challenge for many, but partly driven by this view that his ideology was all about the state over private companies. We see that much more like a pendulum, where China's innovated so much that it got to the point where they had to regulate far harder than the rest of the world because its companies are leading in many spaces in that point. And actually what you saw with the handshake with Jack Ma earlier in February this year, and the tech sector in general, was that the private sector is back. So 2 of those 3 things are now looking much more positive. Geopolitics is one that we just are going to have to get used to when it comes to investing in China, whether that's US, China geopolitics. Clearly, China's place in the world economically and politically has changed quite significantly over the last 20 years, and that is likely to continue to cause us some troubles when we're investing there. I mean, DeepSeek's a brilliant example of a company, a private company in China, no government influence, that has been able to do something that the rest of the world didn't think it was able to do. And if anything, it sort of opened up the eyes of the rest of the world to the kind of underappreciated innovation that's going on in China. So we could see that in the EV space, where China clearly leads the world in terms of EV ecosystem. That goes into batteries, that goes into renewable energy. But whether it's digitization on the consumption side, whether it's industrial automation on the climate side, whether it's various different forms of modern technology, 5G, infrastructure, things like that, I guess AI with DeepSeek, all of those are just awakening the world to kind of what's going on in China that perhaps many people haven't yet appreciated. Partly because a lot of the story has been focused on the risks rather than the opportunities, and to some extent just trying to balance that discussion I think is really quite important when trying to find and invest in the best companies in the world. There's a number of really exciting growth companies coming out of China, partly because of its scale and just the size of its markets. And if we take the example I mentioned of EV space, for example, you've had BYD 10 years ago. People were disparaging of the kind of cars it was producing, but China's scale and industrial policy has effectively delivered one of the world's leading EV car makers, now making roughly 4 million cars on the EV side and the hybrids together, increasingly exporting that to the rest of the world as well. So whilst we in the West may not have necessarily heard of BYD, we could look at its market share in Brazil or Thailand or the global South. We could look at its market share domestically. The real attraction is it's vertically integrated, it makes its own batteries, that helps. The scale of China's ecosystem allows it to be far cheaper. But China's no longer about being cheap and low quality. It's about being cheap and, in some instances, particularly with BYD cars, better quality than the equivalent out there. And we think that's quite an exciting starting point. And arguably because of the big picture broad generalizations, the valuations of these kind of companies are really not reflective of the opportunities and seemingly more reflective of the risks.